references to prostitution and sexually transmitted diseases. Hello, I am PJ. I am a historian, and today I'm going to be telling you about a very overlooked part of my favorite time period in history, and that is the social hygiene movement that happened at the near the end of the Progressive Era. So, for some context, the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era were marked by a rise of city living, and with that came all of the downsides of living in the cities in the late 1800s and early 1900s. So germs had only recently been discovered and was still being debated by the science community as a whole. And cities in this time period tended to pack people in very tightly, making these cities filthy and easy for outbreaks of diseases to occur. And while this was the case in cities before, it was never expected for people to stay in the city too long, as more people would die in a city, and it was also expected that the majority of people in a country would work on farms to provide food for themselves and the nation. But this was changed by the rise of industrialization, as people could live in cities, work in factories, and be able to afford that. But it should be noted that despite this, factories still weren't really paying a lot. And while many people would stick with this factory job, others would turn to the oldest profession. Yes, many women would become prostitutes to make a living in the city, either to support themselves or their family. Sex work is what many would turn to. Both the filth and the sex work gave the impression that the cities were unclean, crime would taint on the nation. Many felt that something had to change. Thus, the social hygiene movement, sometimes referred to as the mental hygiene movement, was started to clean the cities both physically and morally. Part 1. The movement. The worry about the cities got to John D. Rockefeller, Jr., son of the oil tycoon. The society ills worried him enough that he would create the Bureau of Social Hygiene, and this would work to examine the prostitution and drug use of the city, which was a very polite move considering the fact that Standard Oil was the reason that some of the poor were in the conditions that they were. Still, by 1914, this and smaller bureaus would combine to make the American Social Hygiene Association. This would focus on treating infernal diseases, as well as educating the public on drug use, criminal diseases, and prostitution. Basically, this movement was like I said, rolled into one. Unlike most social movements, focusing on educating and treating people was the main extent of this movement. While some did try to make reforms, the movement was rather quiet compared to most of what was going on during this time period. This is why, in my opinion at least, this topic is very rarely talked about. There isn't really any big movement like a law getting passed or like protests that I can point to like show more about this time period. It really was just educating people and treating people. That being said, there were some important people to this movement, but let's talk about them. Part 2, the people. In a time when most people tried to hide most things involving sex from the family for the sake of being pure. A guy named Dr. Prince A. Morrow would push for sex education in public schools. The education would allow students to make the right decision make the right decisions for their bodies and hopefully keep them away from prostitution. This idea for sex education in schools was very bold for the time. And he did have some effects. The first place to implement sex education was Chicago in 1913. The program would be short-lived as parents were worried that sex education would ruin their kids with impure thoughts like unwanted pregnancy and homosexuality. The horror. Along with trying to clean minds with education, he also tried to clean the cities. In 1905, he founded the Society of Sanitary and Moral Prophylaxis in New York City. This would work to implement a cleaning process to make the cities less of a disgusting germ factory, as well as educating the public on the harms of prostitution and drug use. Another figure in the movement and one of the founding members of the birth control movement is Margaret Sanger. Sanger grew up in poverty with her many siblings, being exposed to uncontrolled fertility and unwanted pregnancies in the lives around her. This would inspire her to become very invested in birth control as she became an adult, so much that she would found the first birth control clinic in the United States. This would get her arrested as contraceptives were illegal in the United States at this time. Still, to help the United States with their purity problem, Sanger would push for access to birth control, although this leads to Part 3, The Dark Movement. For those of you who don't know, the idea behind eugenics is that for the sake of the regular, normal population, certain groups of people should not be allowed to have children. It ran off the idea of survival of the fittest and a misunderstanding of Charles Darwin's ideas of evolution. This idea was widely accepted by the science of the time, and when it was used to attack racial groups, the disabled, and the poor. The court case Buck v. Bill would famously say, 3 generations of imbeciles is enough when it legalized forced sterilization on the mentally disabled. As you can imagine, there was some overlap with the social hygiene movement. Although it's unknown how closely tied to the eugenics movement Sanger was, she is quoted as saying that birth control would be able to stop the unfit from having children. Additionally, many people in the social hygiene movement were worried about the dangers of drug users, criminals, and prostitutes having kids. For some, they were worried that the cycle would just continue, that this would just lead to yet another generation of sinful acts, similar to what the eugenic movement would say of the disabled population. And this is some troubling history, but it's important to learn that a movement with the well-intentioned goal of cleaning the cities can still get tied into the ideas of the time. Part 4, The Movement Today. Well, Sanger would be arrested for her clinic. It would be the precursor for Planned Parenthood. Some of the services Planned Parenthood provides, like STD screenings and birth control, line up with the idea of the movement. While Sanger's legacy is complicated, she still did work to stigmatize contraceptives in America. Also, sex education is in schools now. Dr. Merrill got his wish. So yes, this movement, despite how quiet it is, still has impact on America today.